Hello and good afternoon. It's Matt Brown here. I'm Vice President in the Management Consulting division of AFRI. And we're going to talk today about green hydrogen. What are the commercial issues? As you know, AFRI is conducting a series of webinars, mostly on Thursdays, although next week is going to be on Wednesday as it's dealing with the Nordics, and there is a public holiday, I think, on the Thursday in Norway, it may be. You've seen previously in the webinars, if you've joined them, there's a contacts slide for all the local offices. That's on our website. So please follow up locally if you wish to. Of course, we have our, around about 250 energy experts around the world still working away on what's happening in energy markets. Today, we thought we would move away a little bit from the COVID-19 impact and not talk about COVID for a half an hour. It seemed like a good idea. So I've got my colleague, John Williams, who looks after our gas practice. He is on the line and is going to be taking us through, and then we're going to have a bit of a Q&A toward the end of the presentation. We have had some questions in advance, which we'll pick up some of those, but feel free to put some questions in the questions box and we'll do our best to answer if we have some time. If not, we will follow up afterwards with those as well. So what's going to be covered today, as you can see here on the agenda, why hydrogen? Why are people talking about it? Just a little reprise really of why we're talking about hydrogen. Then we're going to step through the commercial decisions facing green hydrogen projects, which are not as straightforward as you might at first think. Touch upon hydrogen production costs. Of course, everything is shifting, but these are our best views of where hydrogen production costs are heading. And then we'll do the Q&A. So with that, I will hand over to John, who can take us through. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Matt, for the introduction. So as Matt mentioned, we'll talk a little bit about hydrogen, green hydrogen projects, and then think about some of the production costs. So first of all, I think we need to recognize that decarbonisation is the main driver for hydrogen development in Europe. And this is because when it's combusted, hydrogen emits now CO2. So it can be substituted for methane and other fossil fuels in a number of applications. And in particular, people are looking to hydrogen because it can play a role where electrification is either difficult or maybe too expensive. So specifically, it can have a role in transport, residential and industrial heat, and also as a feedstock to decarbonise certain industries such as steel production. But it can also be used to store energy, as electricity can be converted to hydrogen via electrolysis. So when electricity prices are low or when renewable generation is curtailed, it might be an attractive option for generators. And so it's this role of renewables alongside hydrogen production that we're going to look at today, to look at some of the key commercial issues facing green hydrogen developers. So, but first, let's remind ourselves of the different production methods for hydrogen and the different colours that people have conveniently applied to the different methods. So, first of all, grey hydrogen. Now, this is by far the most common form of hydrogen production today in refineries, ammonia production, and also in chemical manufacturing. It's also the cheapest form of hydrogen production, and it's through the reformation of gas or the gasification of other fossil fuels. So it breaks down the hydrocarbons into hydrogen and carbon. The big issue with grey hydrogen is that it emits CO2. And so in a decarbonised energy system, it can't have a future role. Now, blue hydrogen, which is also produced from fossil fuels, predominantly methane or natural gas, but here the carbon dioxide that is produced is captured and either reused or stored via the incorporation of CCUS into the process. And it is claimed that up to a 97 to 98% capture rate can be achieved. Now, another blue hydrogen technology is pyrolysis, in which methane is reacted in a vacuum to produce hydrogen and either solid carbon or solid graphite. This could be a zero carbon hydrogen production method, and it does have great potential, although it is still at the earlier phases of development. Now, thirdly, and importantly for today, green hydrogen. This is produced when electricity from a zero carbon source is used to split water into hydrogen and oxygen via electrolysis. So green hydrogen is often promoted as the only zero carbon alternative to grey hydrogen. And that sounds great, but we have to remember that electrolyzer costs are still high compared to grey hydrogen production and also blue hydrogen production. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. And it's not until we see large-scale electrolyzer projects that we'll start to see the costs of green hydrogen reduce. But they are now starting to be developed with 100 megawatt electrolyzers and larger, which is a significant development in size. But what's important to remember here is that when an electrolyzer is connected to an electricity grid, that the carbon intensity of the grid needs to be taken into account. So just connecting an electrolyzer to the grid doesn't necessarily result in green hydrogen. So in terms of thinking about some of the projects, you can see from the map here, and just a very brief selection of some of the projects. There are lots of projects going on in Europe at the moment, both in terms of green and some blue hydrogen projects as well. And these range from some smaller specific end-use projects, such as green hydrogen to fuel city bus fleets, to some of the larger industrial cluster projects. Some of the larger, more ambitious projects include the North H2 project in the Netherlands, which is a green hydrogen project. And this would see up to 10 gigawatts of wind energy being used to produce up to 800,000 tons of hydrogen annually. This is probably the largest green hydrogen project that's been announced so far. In Portugal, the Sines project would develop a large solar PV park to produce hydrogen. This hydrogen would be used locally, but also exported to the Netherlands. And this would see an investment of over 1.6 billion euro over the next decade. Another ambitious project is the H21 project in the UK, and this is a blue hydrogen project, so is methane reformation with CCS, and this potentially could produce enough hydrogen to decarbonise much of the north of England by replacing natural gas in industry, but also in residential heating. Now, when considering green hydrogen projects, there are a number of technical and commercial issues that need to be considered. And these include the type, location, and capacity of renewable generation, the capacity of the grid connection, or whether to bypass the grid completely, the type and capacity of electrolyzer, the storage and transport of hydrogen, and importantly, the end use application. Now, consideration of the costs and different revenue streams will be crucial for project developers, but also for the project operators that will need to optimize electricity market revenues and hydrogen production on a daily or even within day basis. Now, although there's huge interest in green hydrogen, it's probably fair to say that there are differing views about the potential role and scale of deployment, both for blue and green hydrogen. There are just a couple of quotes here from the last month showing some of those differing views. But what is important to remember is that displacing grey hydrogen in existing applications and encouraging use in new sectors is going to be a real challenge and is going to require policy mechanisms and support in order to enable the kick-starting of the low carbon hydrogen industry. And when I use the term low carbon, I'm referring both to green and to blue hydrogen, but not grey. So if we start thinking then about a green hydrogen project at a high level, this will usually start as a renewable generation project based on wind or solar. So for this example, let's imagine the intention is to generate electricity primarily to feed into the electricity grid. So initial decisions will be focused on the type of renewable generation technology, the location in order that you can take advantage of the best renewable resource, and the overall capacity of the development. Now, key to the project economics will be the expected revenue from the sale of electricity into the wholesale market. However, as we know, and as we've seen in a number of markets, electricity prices are highly volatile, and we are seeing periods of very low, zero, or even negative prices. The price track you can see here shows the day ahead and the imbalance price for Germany for a week in June last year as an example. Now, where there's exposure to the wholesale market, then it may be prudent to consider other uses for the electricity, as I said, when prices are low, zero, or negative. And this is where hydrogen enters the equation. So when considering this, you need to think about what your expected wholesale prices are, what your exposure to the wholesale market is, what is your expected load factor, and how many hours you expect to supply electricity to the grid, which will inform you about the level of revenue you can expect to receive. And so the main question for us today to think about is adding an electrolyzer a good idea? But this then can result in a whole new set of issues to consider. Should you go for an alkaline or proton exchange membrane or PEM electrolyzer? What capacity should it have? How many hours would you expect it to run for? And how much hydrogen will you produce? And more importantly, what will the cost of your hydrogen production be? And will it be competitive with alternative sources? So will you be able to sell your hydrogen and make a return? Now, because renewable generation is intermittent and the main revenue will come from the electricity market, it's possible that the electrolyzer utilization could be low. And this is likely to lead to an uneven production of hydrogen and a high unit cost of production. So another issue to think about is whether to put in place a grid connection for the electrolyzer. And this could improve its utilization and also lower the unit cost of hydrogen production. But remember, and this is important, that any electricity sourced from the grid must be zero carbon. Otherwise, the hydrogen won't be green. And it's been reported that in some markets where the generation sector has a high carbon intensity, the carbon footprint of grid-connected electrolysis can actually be higher than grey hydrogen. So this is an important element to bear in mind. Now, it's also likely that the hydrogen produced will need to be stored in hydrogen storage tanks, or for some larger projects, potentially in some underground storage caverns. And it is possible to convert some natural gas salt caverns to store hydrogen as well. Now, the capacity of the storage is going to depend on how much hydrogen you're being produced, and also what is the end use application and where that end user is going to be located. And now, once we start to think about the end users for hydrogen, this is probably one of the most important aspects of a green hydrogen project. And the key question is, where are you going to sell the hydrogen? So there is currently no hydrogen wholesale market, and there's very little transparency on the prices paid by end users for the current grey hydrogen. So does a project need to be part of an integrated development that covers the whole value chain from production through to consumption? This can then lead to decisions on where to locate the hydrogen production, and it's a trade-off between where you get the best renewable resource and where the end user is located. And this is a key issue, not just for green, but also for blue hydrogen. grey hydrogen is usually produced on site, so all you need is a gas connection and space for a methane reformer, but this is likely not to be the case for most green and blue hydrogen projects. Now, hydrogen can be and is transported, but this adds to the complexity and the cost of delivering hydrogen to an end user. Transportation will normally be done by either tanker or pipeline for short to medium distances. But as this increases costs, it can affect the competitiveness of hydrogen once it's delivered to the end user. And remember what I just said about the grey hydrogen usually being produced and consumed on the same site. Now, transport costs are also a key issue affecting hydrogen produced from low-cost renewables. Although the production cost of hydrogen from large solar developments in the Middle East, for example, can be very low, by the time it's transported to other markets, it can be much less competitive. Now, liquid hydrogen transportation is possible, but it's not an easy process, as the hydrogen needs to be supercooled, and it also suffers from 1 to 3% of boil off. So you lose the amount of hydrogen in energy terms from your hydrogen production to your destination. Hydrogen can be converted to ammonia, which is much easier to transport, but again, this increases the complexity and the cost. It's also possible to attach hydrogen molecules to a carrier through LOHC technology, but this requires hydrogenation at the hydrogen production site and dehydrogenation at the destination site. And again, this is adding to costs and complexity. Now, a further option to provide another revenue stream could see the addition of a fuel cell. So here you would be converting the hydrogen back into electricity, and this may be an option where either you expect electricity prices to be high on occasion, or you could provide system services back to the grid. Now, here it would be necessary to consider what periods of high prices are expected. Are you in the right location to provide system services, and what type and size of fuel cell should be acquired? Now, that's looking at the options or the decision points for a project that is selling electricity to the grid. Now, another fundamental issue to consider is whether you should connect to the grid at all, or whether you should develop an off-grid project so your green hydrogen production is coming from dedicated renewables. So in this case, you take out a lot of the chain, and what you avoid is some of the connection and network charges. The utilization of the electrolyzer can be improved because all the electricity you're generating is going into the electrolyzer, and also there's a zero marginal cost for that electricity that's going into the electrolyzer. But you then need to trade that off against the lack of revenue from electricity sales, and also you're probably going to need good renewable load factors. So this may limit the locations or the type of renewables that are suited to this application. All revenues are going to come from the sale of hydrogen, so you're going to need some certainty on end user pricing and contracts being put in place. And so this is where full chain projects are more likely. Now, it may be possible in some projects to add a battery, which can smooth out the delivery of electricity to the electrolyzer, particularly in terms of solar, where you can possibly put in place a smaller electrolyzer, but smooth or level off the electricity supply, so you can run it at baseload rather than just during daylight hours. And while this could help the economics, it is probably only going to be marginal. So coming on to think about hydrogen production costs, we've undertaken quite a bit of work looking at hydrogen production costs, utilizing our suites of models and also our price projections, which quite a lot of you might be aware of and subscribe to our market reports. So in the following slides, what I'm going to do is show the evolution of hydrogen production costs from 2030, 40 and 50. And all of these are based on our central scenario assumptions and our commodity price projections. So first of all, this chart shows the levelized cost of hydrogen production for a project that starts in 2030. So this isn't saying the costs of hydrogen production in 2030 are going to be what you can see on the chart. This is a levelized cost for a project starting in 2030. So moving left to right, the first bar shows a grid-connected alkaline electrolyzer operating at base load and taking each hourly electricity price, which makes up the fuel cost element of what you can see. And in addition to that, you can also see the assumptions that we have for the CapEx and the OpEx of the electrolyzer. The next bar shows the levelized cost for a PEM electrolyzer operating at a 70% load factor. So this is now taking the lowest 70% of hourly electricity prices with the electrolyzer operating flexibly. You'll see the fuel cost is lower, but you'll also see the CapEx and the OpEx elements are higher because of that lower load factor. Overall, this results in a lower levelized cost of production, but would, all other things being equal, produce less hydrogen than the baseload electrolyzer. And what is clear, what I want you to pick up from this is the dominance of the electricity price in the levelized cost. The next bar shows the SMR, or the steam methane reformation bar, which shows the levelized cost of grey hydrogen production. And this again is made up of CapEx, OpEx, and the fuel cost, reflecting our central gas price projections, and also a carbon cost element. Now in 2030, this is the lowest hydrogen production cost. The next bar shows SMR with CCS. So this is showing the effect of adding CCS to methane reformation to produce blue hydrogen. And here the CapEx and OpEx includes carbon capture, but the carbon transport and storage are shown separately. And the addition of CCS in terms of the capture, transport and storage is adding around about 18.5 euros per megawatt hour to the levelized cost. But remember that this is offset by the avoided costs of the CO2 emissions. Now the off-grid green hydrogen bars that you can see show dedicated off-grid hydrogen production for solar and then offshore and onshore wind. Now, because these are not connected to the grid, there is no fuel cost element. All the costs are derived from the CapEx and the OpEx, and this includes both the renewable source and the electrolyzer. Now, our assumption for PEM electrolyzer CapEx in 2030 is 680 euro per kilowatt. Now, it's worth pointing out that this analysis is very country specific. The charts you can see here are based on the Netherlands. If we were to show the same charts, for example, for Spain, you would see a switch. You'd see the solar bar come down, but the wind bars go up slightly, but also you'd see the SMR CCS bar go up. Based on the Netherlands has good access to CCS transport and storage, and so the CCS costs here are relatively lower than they might be in some other countries. So looking at 2040, now we start to see the levelized cost for all production types, apart from grey, reducing. And this means that green hydrogen is now more competitive than grey hydrogen. The shaded parts of the bar show the reduction from the 2030 level you saw on the previous slides. And the reductions in the levelized costs here are largely due to lower CapEx, both for renewables and electrolyzers, and also some reductions in the CCS costs. So you can see here now that onshore wind is now much closer to the levelized cost of blue hydrogen, although blue is still the cheapest form of hydrogen production in 2040. The reduction for the green hydrogen is largely due to reductions in renewables, but also because our central electrolyser capex now reduces from 680 to 595 euros per kilowatt hour. Now, by 2050, we see a further closing of the gap between onshore wind and blue hydrogen. And this is largely as a result of a reduction in electrolyser capex here to 510 euro per kilowatt hour. Now, if electrolysis costs can be reduced further, and some have been forecasting 200 euros per kilowatt, green hydrogen in the Netherlands could be the cheapest form of hydrogen production by 2050. But it is important to remember that we should not just be focusing on production costs. We should be considering the complementary roles of blue and green hydrogen can play in the transition to net zero, and we shouldn't be thinking that it's one or the other. What we need to consider is the delivered cost of hydrogen rather than just the production costs, and these vary significantly due to transportation costs and end user application. And whilst it becomes cheaper to produce blue and green hydrogen than grey hydrogen could still be competitive as I mentioned earlier, it's produced on site, and so will have very low storage and transportation costs. So just to sum up, we all know there's significant interest in hydrogen. We can see that by the number of hydrogen projects that are announced and underway. But remember that many of these projects are unlikely to achieve fruition without some form of subsidy or support. There are still lots of technical and economic challenges that need to be overcome, both for green and blue hydrogen projects. Perhaps the biggest challenge for low carbon hydrogen is making it attractive to the existing end users who are using grey hydrogen, who want to decarbonise, but also want to maintain their competitive position. And so finally, before moving on to some questions, I just want to highlight the type of work we've been doing in the hydrogen area. And this has ranged from development of hydrogen strategies through to detailed analysis and modelling to identifying policy and support mechanisms that may be required. And we've been working for a range of clients from utility companies, infrastructure companies, gas producers, development banks and power producers. And we've been working in many European countries, but also in some other regions such as China. So for any other information or for more detailed analysis that we can carry out, please do get in touch with us. So I'm going to hand back to Matt, give my voice a rest for a second, and he will deal with some questions.
So thanks very much, John. And just to say, I forgot to say at the beginning, the webinars are all recorded. The slide packs are all available. All of that's going to be up on the AFRY site. And indeed, we email out to everyone who is registered a copy and a link, so you can access that easily. So we had some, I think we got quite a few questions come up on the panel there. We'll hopefully get onto one or two of those, but I'll just, with the questions that had come in beforehand, John, I will start with the last one, if that's okay, because time is short, which is how competitive is renewable electrolysis compared to H2 produced in the Kverna solid carbon processor using CH4. I don't know if I've said Kverna properly then.
I think that's okay. It's a good question. And the answer probably isn't straightforward, unfortunately. Now, the Kverna process is one of the technologies that falls under pyrolysis, which I mentioned, but only briefly. Now, this process involves reacting natural gas, CH4, in a vacuum, so there's no oxygen involved. This results in the production of hydrogen and solid carbon. And the solid carbon can then be reused in some specific applications, and so it has a value which can help project economics. But even if we become swamped by solid carbon and so the value reduces, it is still much easier to transport and store than carbon dioxide. So it sounds great, but it is a developing technology. And although there's lots of work going on and a number of demonstration projects, it has still not yet been deployed at scale. Now, we've been looking at some analysis about pyrolysis, and this would suggest that large-scale pyrolysis plants could produce hydrogen somewhere between the costs of SMR, CCS and green hydrogen by 2030. Moving forward, we saw just now that green hydrogen production costs are going to come down. It's then a question of how quickly pyrolysis costs can reduce, how quickly some at-scale projects can be developed, and what is the learning curve to see whether the costs come down. So it is possible it could continue to be competitive with green hydrogen and blue hydrogen beyond 2030. But coming back to one of my previous points, they shouldn't be seen as one or the other. They should be seen as complementary. So in places where CCS is either not supported or is not available, then pyrolysis can be an important technology to achieve the scale of hydrogen production needed to help achieve net zero. One of the issues I should have mentioned earlier is that green hydrogen, one of the issues is deploying it at scale. And whilst there are going to be some large scale projects, there might not be enough of these large scale projects to help meet the potential hydrogen demand. And this is where we think blue hydrogen is needed, maybe as a transition before lots of at-scale green hydrogen projects are developed, but probably into the future as well. And what blue hydrogen, including SMR, CCS and pyrolysis, enable is hydrogen production at scale. Because it's produced from natural gas, so it can be connected to the existing natural gas network, it will have higher load factors, and therefore blue hydrogen will have an important role to play as we move forward, and even as green hydrogen becomes more competitive and available at scale.
Lovely, thank you very much. I think because the time is over, it's 2:32, what I will suggest is for the questions, both those that have been sent in during the webinar and those we had in advance, we will get back to people individually with answers. There are some questions coming in about CO2 prices, so on and so forth. So also mixing of hydrogen with natural gas, safety, all of that, all of those areas. But we'll get back to you with some answers on that front. If you could kick on to the last one, just to say, you know, John leads our gas practice at AFRY. He is available to talk to you about any of these things, so please get in touch. And then next week's webinar is on Nordic and Baltic energy markets, the near future. So please feel free to sign up on that. It's about where these markets are heading, and obviously with our footprint in the Nordics, we thought it might be an interesting topic to cover as well. I think just to say again, thank you for joining, and as I said, these will be available to you. I think we'll close the webinar there. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you, everyone. Please do get in touch.